Our journey with Pink Floyd is quickly coming to its conclusion. I'm going to wrap this up by tackling the two Post-Waters albums in one: Momentary Lapse in Reason, and of course, The Division Bell. Now, these two albums were of course filled with a lot of uncertainty for the band, whether or not they were going to continue or not, or whether or not they were going to even be able to use the Pink Floyd name, as Roger Waters maintained his contact with the band through a series of banters and lawsuits and attempts to, well, you could almost say, prevent the band from going on. However, two albums still remained. Two albums were still able to materialize. And two albums that actually showed the band in a different direction than they were whenever we last left them. The post-Waters regime meant that the other members of the band now had to tackle the songwriting duties. They no longer had Roger at the helm to provide them with any sort of idea for concept or anything of that nature. So instead, David Gilmour and the boys had to do this on their own. And they were able to produce two albums that, for what it's worth, are able to maintain moments that really kind of tackle the idea that Pink Floyd had been able to conjure up since their inception, only once again in a slightly different way. If you remember back to their first albums, they were a much different band than they were during their 1970s heyday, and whenever we last left them with the final cut, it was almost like the band had kind of taken a 180-degree turn. However, with a momentary lapse of reason, the band kind of arced their music a little bit more structured. There was a little bit more of a friendliness to it. There was a little bit more of, while it still maintained the same sort of darkness to it, there was a little bit of a lighter side to it. This is all music that seemed to have that same charm to it that Pink Floyd was able to really deliver in the 1970s, but it was done so with some methodology that seems to resemble more of really, really good pop rock songs. Momentary Lapse of Reason gave us a couple of different singles, and Learning to Fly is the one that really comes to mind as one of the most prominently played still to this day. However, we're going to jump really quickly to the Division Bell, because overall, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, while a decent album, does have times in which it feels sort of loose and disconnected. However, overall, it definitely was an improvement and a step sort of in the right direction, considering the final cut was such a polarizing and very difficult disc for a lot of people to get into. It's either your favorite or it's one of your worst or least favorites. That an album such as this, one that just seems to be kind of middle-of-the-road average, a very safe album, almost seems to, well, have been the proper course of action. The Division Bell was Pink Floyd's final album, and it still had one of the same problems that A Momentary Lapse of Reason was boasting, and that was the fact that it still seemed kind of loose, disconnected, and didn't seem to have a real flow to it. After so many years of having concept albums, or at least loose concept albums from the band, the fans had kind of come to expect a certain level of flow from their albums, from front to back, from start to finish. And these are two albums that really didn't deliver that all that much. This is really kind of an album that was sort of to set up exactly what this was meant to be. The Division Bell, while not necessarily intended to be the final Pink Floyd release, ended up being the final Pink Floyd release, and they kind of went out with a very ironic end. And that's the one thing that has always kind of been the subtle charm to the Division Bell for listeners such as myself, and for many listeners around the world. High Hopes is the final song on the Division Bell, and it's kind of fitting that this is the final song that was played by this band that was of new material. High Hopes kind of grants this illusion of ending. It kind of gives you this coda feeling where you understand that this is the final bow of one of music's best acts, one of the most commercially successful acts in rock and roll history. And it is a song that certainly sets the tone, sets the atmosphere, and sets the mood, and does so very well. The soaring solo at the end only kind of does nothing more but bring tears to your eyes, because you know that this is it. This is it. And that's a crushing feeling. The album overall is not a bad affair. It's something that once again is extremely varied, and once again is kind of loose and kind of disjointed at points. However, overall, like A Momentary Lapse of Reason, The Division Bell is once again a minor improvement. It was another album that was pretty solid. Now, High Hopes is a song that you'll still hear on the radio from time to time. However, whenever you think about it, this is almost a song that you would like to enjoy privately. You want to enjoy the song maybe after a long day, or thinking to yourself that, well, This is it. There would be no new beginning for Pink Floyd, and while the band was able to reconvene at the Live Aid event a couple of years ago, there are still no talks of another Pink Floyd record. These are the two lasting memories that we will have, the final memories of the band that was able to produce such classic albums such as Wish You Were Here, Dark Side of the Moon, The Wall, Metal, Animals. The list goes on and on. However, these two albums are an important benchmark for the band. It was important for them to recover from the final cut, which was, like I said, an album that was very difficult to recover from, especially after the personal turmoil and the aftermath that took place after its release. This was also very important for David Gilmour. This was also very important for the other members of the band. They kind of were able to get everything together and reconvene and still make music that still had that same spark and passion. However, it was just not as... It wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect. And that's the reason why these albums are both kind of just run-of-the-mill average, slightly above average. Whenever I think of Pink Floyd's latter part of their career, it's something that's not always the albums that you want to listen to. However, they are nice treats. They are nice treats to go back to and remember the lineage of Pink Floyd, remember the history of Pink Floyd, remember the chronology of Pink Floyd, and understand that during these times, fans stuck with them, even though times seemed at their worst. Even though the future of the band seemed extremely uncertain, the fans still remained steadfast, knowing that they were going to do their best to try and produce a record that would satisfy them. Whether or not they were successful in that endeavor is, of course, up to the listener. However, to them themselves, these are two albums that were finally a little bit drama-free. They were finally two albums that they were able to produce with limited outside involvement. And while they were still dealing with Roger nagging them every so often, it was no different than whenever Sid would randomly pop in every so often. Pink Floyd's history has been one of turbulence. It's been one of successes, failures, experiments, and of course the ultimate goal of being able to retire on top. While The Division Bell might not have been a classic Pink Floyd album, while it may not be one that is cited as one of the best in rock history, it, in my opinion, has something that a lot of those other albums do not. And that's the most fitting final track, perhaps of all time. Whenever you think of High Hopes, you think of End. Whenever you think of High Hopes, the words, you think of Inception. You think of the beginning, Birthright. Brilliant irony, done by a brilliant band, to close out their career and take their final studio bow. Thank you all for taking this journey with me, this long journey, and stay tuned for the next discography here on the Cover Killer Nation channel.